By way of review then, 1130 of the Common Era, it saw the Council of Claremont prohibit monastic medicine, and a few examples we had of some of those healers, Saint Bede, for example, Saint Hildegard, and I really tried to give you that impression of what medicine looked at that point of time. And the Council of Claremont, they say, this stuff is just too disruptive to the life of a monk. Now, the other thing that's beginning to take place is as knowledge or medical knowledge shifts out of the hands of monastic medicine, we see the emergence of scholastic medicine. And this is all very serendipitous because something else has taken place. There's been a movement of Arabic science and Arabic knowledge into the West, and it's being translated at these newly founded universities. So there's a major translation movement. So we've got this major translation movement, and I want to remind you here that originally the material was written in Greek. It was translated into Arabic, and now it's being translated not into Greek, but into Latin. That's the language that people are using around 1130, 1200 of the Common Era. And this is going to play a role also in the emergence of the Renaissance, and as people begin to challenge some of the misinterpretations that have taken place when they start to refer or look back at the Latin texts versus Greek texts, they note that there's a few problems. So anyhow, we've got these newly founded universities, there's a translation movement underway, and ultimately a revival of learning. Things are looking good. And in fact, the climate has changed, and it's very conducive for the development of crops. Spinach, it's being adopted into the West, as have rabbits as a foodstuff. Times are looking good. Let's take a look at this graph here at climate change so we can see, or at least correlate, some of the changes that are taking place in culture alongside of the changes that are taking place in the environment. So right about here, we've got the Council of Claremont, and then we have a major translation movement around 1200. And if we go up, what we see is this period that's referred to as that medieval optimum. And what this means is the climate, it's changed, it's become warmer, it's become moister, very similar to the type of climate that we have today. And then all of a sudden, and now you can imagine this type of climate, it's good for the growth of crops. So we're seeing abundant crops, lots of resources, and then all of a sudden, a little ice age. This is going to have a significant impact upon availability of resources. And so here, times are good during the 1200s. There's substantial population growth. Let's highlight that. There's a lot of population growth, okay? I want you to think back to what happens when we have a lot of individuals living in, well, less than clean environments. So there's a lot of resources at this point of time. And as we move into this mini ice age, resources, they're going to start to deplete. People aren't going to be as healthy as they were in the past, and that's going to have an impact upon their immune system. And we also have learning, a lot of learning taking place, and ultimately there's going to be an end to that because of the strife that the Black Death provides. So Andrew Nikiforuk, he explains, quote, 1991, page 57, one crop failure after another forced Europeans to eat nettles, dove shit, gross, and even children, grosser, while the cat and dog populations disappeared into cooking pots. Hungry crowds rushed the gallows to hack the flesh off of murderers and thieves. There's a lot of distress going on, and here I want to point out that, in fact, drinking blood of freshly deceased criminals, that was kind of commonplace in the Middle Ages. Let's take a look at some of these practices. Let's move to the next slide, and I'll read to you a little bit from Pandora's Box 18.1. This image of Marilyn Manson, I think, captures the spirit of the time. Vampirism had been practiced for therapeutic reasons since at least the gladiator games around the time of Celsus, about the 2nd century of the Common Era. It didn't decline with Roman paganism, but rather continued well into the 1800s in some regions of Christian Europe. In ancient times, the blood of wounded gladiators was thought to help cure epilepsy. People believed that blood could be used as a general elixir. For example, a Franciscan monk made marmalade from human blood, and during the 19th century, people held their cups under freshly executed criminals in an effort to fill those cups with what they believed was a cure for epilepsy. Moving on, it was fairly common for Northern Europeans to make various remedies from the fat and blood of dead people. To be sure, both Paracelsus, and we'll talk a little bit about him, and Schroeder recommended harvesting the flesh and fat from freshly deceased individuals. Schroeder even went on to the suggestion that the flesh of a reddish man who died a violent death around 24 years of age should be cured like meat and used as an elixir for general well-being. You know, in the end, when we look at this, there's no question about it. People harvested human blood, fat, and flesh. They wore it, ate it, in an effort to protect themselves against a variety of ailments, such as plague, gout, epilepsy, bruises, and wounds. How many diseases could have been spread by such practices? You know, as scary as times were during the 1300s, the medieval period, 1347 to 1351, represents really a horrifying moment in human history. And smallpox, for example, has killed probably more individuals than any other disease globally over time. There's no question about that. But the Black Death, 1347, in its 5-year debut, I'm going to go with kind of a middle-of-the-road estimate here. It killed 50 million individuals in Europe. Now, let's put that into perspective. How many people lived in Europe at the time? Approximately 80 million. The lower end estimate suggests 25 million, so we can say anywhere between 25 to 50 million, but most scholars accept the higher limits. Let's take a look at the Black Death, what caused the Black Death, how people responded, and what type of world the Black Death produced. The agent that's responsible for the Black Death, it's referred to as Yersinia pestis. I'll highlight it up here for you, Yersinia pestis. And it's a bacterial infection. As we've discussed at various points of time, and much earlier in the course, the route through which the Black Death reaches humans begins with rats. Okay, so rat populations, they'll carry this bacteria, Yersinia pestis. And when fleas drink rats' blood, they pick up that infection. Eventually, rats, they die off because this disease will kill them as well. They're not the natural reservoir. And fleas, they look for a new blood meal, and they get that blood from humans. As pointed out, populations had increased. And now individuals, they're living in dire times already. Mortality, we've already pointed out, 25 to 50 million individuals. So this initial form that we're looking at, number one here, from rats to fleas to humans, that's referred to as the bubonic plague. And the bubonic plague, it creates a characteristic buboes. You're a bubo, so it's a big lump. Where the lymphatic, for example, gland on your throat or under your arm or in the groin area, it begins to enlarge with this bacillus, and it starts to turn purple and black and eventually opens up. So it's vectored. Okay, we want to go up to the top. It's vectored from fleas. They're responsible for vectoring it. Rats carry it, fleas vector it, humans contract it. If This continues and it moves into the lungs. This is where you start to have human-to-human transmission, pneumonic plague. So that's a respiratory infection that can be transmitted between, go down here and we'll say humans. Let's move on. In the same way that there's no shortage of conspiracy and alternate theories today for COVID, for example, people burning down G5 networks. The same can be said of the Black Death. And it's in these times of uncertainty that people start to work with alternate ideas. Now, a number of ideas for the plague, the medieval explanations. Number one, people look to the planets. And there was an odd alignment between Mars, Venus, and Jupiter. I wanted to say Saturn. Mars, Venus, and Jupiter, and they thought that that was causing the plague. Some individuals, they said, no, it's caused by a miasma, a bad air. And they looked for the fogs. The fogs didn't come in. This disease, it was ultimately invisible, being transmitted through the salivary material in the gut of the flea. Some people thought that this was the apocalypse, and a heavenly letter circulated where apparently this was given to humans from the angels, and they said, you're to blame. You've been bad. You're being punished, and the world is coming to an end. Some people thought that Pope Clement, who apparently liked to drink and he liked to hang out with a lot of women, they thought that he caused the plague. And then some people began to turn to other alternate sources. They began to stigmatize individuals. And you know what? Donald Trump, he continues to do this. He said a number of times in his debate against Biden even, he called COVID-19 the China plague. This also happened in the past. People have always stigmatized other individuals, and we should be smart enough not to do it today. Shame on Trump. The Black Death shaped world history. There's no question about it. This is one of those areas that we say history is contingent upon. A number of events that took place in the Black Death. It's just that important in world history. So number one, we get massive mortality. Okay, we've pointed out here, even let's go with our estimate. Let's write it up top. Even if we set our lower end to our higher end, 50 million, 25 to 50 million individuals. This is going to play a significant role in the labor force. Now, what ends up happening historically, that people find themselves in a new situation. They have power for the very first time. In the past, there were lots of people to do work, and now there's not enough people, and they can start to demand wages. They can start to ask for a little bit more than what they got in the past. And this leads to the decline of the feudal system. So a new market is beginning to emerge. Wage labor is beginning to emerge as a result of the deaths that the Black Death caused. Further, we also get the development of labor-saving technologies. Now, you have to imagine, with fewer people, we're going to start to develop new technologies. So let's say new tech. New technology to replace or supplement human labor. And one of these new technologies is the printing press. And this has a profound impact, not only on knowledge, but also religion. If you're not familiar, and you should take a look at the textbook, what ends up happening here is, you know what? I'm going to come to this on the next slide. It's just worth stopping and talking about. So we'll just put that off to the side for a second. The next thing is we start to get new forms of skepticism towards religion, new religious movements, flagellants. They move from town to town, flogging themselves, beating themselves into a bloody pulp in an attempt to ask God for his forgiveness. And then individuals turn, they stigmatize minority groups, and they begin to persecute Judaic peoples. And in fact, as pointed out in our textbook, there is no movement comparable to what took place to the Jews at this point of time until it took place again during the Second World War. People were allowed to freely murder Jews in the streets because they believed that they poisoned the wells, the water. They didn't, but the conspiracy theories won out. Let's move on and let's talk a little bit about the printing press and religion, because it's going to be really important for the emergence of the Renaissance. Okay, so here we got massive mortality caused by the Black Death, and that creates labor shortages. And in an attempt to deal with these labor shortages, not only do we see the rise of the feudal system, but we also see the invention of new labor-saving technologies. Okay, a good example of one of these labor-saving technologies, which was underway, at least working on at Gutenberg in the 1440s. Gutenberg's printing press. By, I think around 1450, it was up and running. Now, one of the things that was printed with this printing press is referred to as an indulgence. This was printed by the Church, the Vatican, and it's a letter to St. Peter. And ultimately, it says, the individual that holds this indulgence gets into heaven no matter what. So there's this kind of large commercial advertising scheme that begins to emerge. And there's an individual by the name of Martin Luther. Let's draw him down here. Not Martin Luther King, Martin Luther. Sometimes students add King there. Martin Luther, he's a priest, and he ends up being a reformer of religion. Now he looks at these indulgences, and he says liberties have been taken, and also mistranslations. Now what we need to understand about the printing press, and we need to understand about the Gospels. Originally, the Gospels, they weren't written in Aramaic or Hebrew. They were written in Greek. That was the dominant language of the time. People translated the Old Testaments into Latin. Now, Martin Luther, he thought that, German folk could use a German version. And he was working between the two volumes, working from the Greek and the Latin. And he realized that there were a lot of errors in those books. And when it comes to the Word of God, you don't get to interpret it a way that you see fit as far as he's concerned. God spoke clearly, and he meant what he said. And he did not say that indulgences could be sold to anybody at any point of time so they can get into heaven, even people who are deceased. And he initiates what's referred to as the Protestant Reformation. Now, the Protestant Reformation is important because it's telling people, at least from a religious point of view, academically, that they need to go back to the sources. Ad fontes becomes the motto. back to Greek, learning. Now let's pull in what happened in the 1200s. We said that there was a translation movement. Stuff that was originally written in Greek had been translated to Arabic and had been translated from Arabic to Latin. And scholars begin to argue, and it's taking place in Germanic countries, Protestant nations. They begin to argue that if these mistakes were made with the Gospels, certainly they must have made mistakes with the ancient authors. And they call for a return to those Greek sources, Greek learning, and begin to look at things for the Greek translation. And this initiates a revolution, the Renaissance. I had mentioned other religious reactions. Here's a flagellant procession. These individuals, they beat or they flogged themselves for 33 days in an attempt to appease God and end the plague. And what they did is they had a stick, really with these whips on the end and little pieces of metal, and they hit themselves in the back and tore that metal out in an effort to undergo the same type of pain and suffering that Jesus of Nazareth did. The plague didn't come to an end. And then there were the atrocities committed to Judaic peoples. They were accused of poisoning the water wells. They didn't drink from the same water sources that Christians did. They had religious laws and practices that tended to make them a little bit cleaner, and especially living in their ghettos. So they didn't drink from the Christian water wells, and Christians found this very curious. Why aren't they drinking from the water well? And what's more is they're not dying like we are. They must have poisoned the water. Under torture, some individuals admitted to the allegation, and mass Jewish persecutions and genocide began. Here we see a woodcut depicting what was taking place. And they did not discriminate. When they found Judaic peoples on the streets, they took them all. It didn't make a difference if they were children, if they were elderly, or if they were middle-aged. They took them into the barn and burned them. Jews fled. They went into Northern Europe, where they would face further persecution hundreds of years later. Such a sad story in human history. The Black Death, then, it caused an absolute upheaval of the European worldview. And I can't stress enough how sad it is that Donald Trump continues to call COVID, and we've discussed this, there certainly is a relationship, but China is not entirely to blame for the outbreak of this pandemic. Every nation that sees high mortality is responsible. They haven't adopted physical distancing. They haven't believed in the use of PPE. They gather, even though there's limitations. They continue to travel. Well, you can't travel between the United States and Canada, for example. Well, by car. You can via plane. So Donald Trump here, he's really failed to understand anything about world history and how, when we create stigma and we racialize disease and we blame other people, the backlash that can take place towards those people. And I think Judaic peoples during the 1300s provide us with a prime example. And we could look at epidemic after epidemic after epidemic. We see this type of backlash towards minorities. Donald Trump is guilty of that. And as the President of the United States, he should know better. Either way, the Black Death that causes an upheaval of the European worldview and sets the stage for the emergence of the Renaissance. We're going to leave it there. We're going to pick up with the discussion of the Renaissance. Take care.